Imagine waking up one day to find a stranger sitting at the edge of your bed. This stranger knows your every secret, every suppressed desire, every hidden resentment, every impulse you've sworn you'd never act upon. They don't flinch when you glare at them. They don't speak. They simply exist, breathing slowly in the dark, waiting. You feel their presence not as a threat, but as an inevitability. And then, the most disquieting thought arrives. This stranger is you. For a moment you try to dismiss the image. We all like to believe we know ourselves. We can list our likes, dislikes, our strengths, our weaknesses, our personality types from online quizzes. Yet something deeper hums beneath that surface. An undercurrent you've avoided naming. It shows itself in flashes of jealousy you can't explain, in anger you didn't think you were capable of, in inexplicable attractions and aversions. It leaks out in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in the sudden, uncharacteristic way you might treat a loved one when tired or afraid. Carl Jung called this undercurrent the shadow. It is everything about you that you don't want to see, and yet it shapes every thought and action. Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." This is no poetic metaphor. This is a psychological law. What you refuse to confront in yourself doesn't disappear. It grows roots and acts through you, silently. But here is the paradox. The more you try to be good, rational, or in control, the more powerful this hidden self becomes. You can suppress anger until you explode in rage. You can repress desire until it warps into obsession. You can strive to be selfless until resentment poisons your relationships. In your attempt to curate an acceptable self-image, you are also sculpting a monstrous counterpart, not because you're evil, but because you're human. Why does this happen? Why can't we simply choose who we are and discard the rest like outdated clothing? Why must every virtue cast a shadow? Perhaps because light and darkness are not opposites to be separated, but forces to be integrated. But integration demands something far more difficult than denial. It demands courage, honesty, and a willingness to be uncomfortable. Think about it. Every time you criticize someone for being selfish, a part of you may be secretly afraid of your own selfishness. Every time you despise another person's arrogance, you may be disowning your own latent pride. Every time you tell yourself you're over a trauma, but still feel a sting of envy, bitterness, or shame, the shadow is speaking. It isn't whispering from a distant cave. It's woven into your gestures, your relationships, your habits. Now ask yourself, how much of your life is truly your own? How many decisions, preferences, and values are actually guided by the unacknowledged forces inside you? What if your shadow is not merely a personal quirk, but a collective inheritance, a mirror of the unconscious drives of your family, your culture, your species? This is not an easy invitation. To look at the shadow is to risk shattering the image you've built of yourself. It is to discover that you are not only capable of the virtues you admire, but also of the impulses you condemn. It is to realize that the line between hero and villain, saint and sinner, runs straight through your own heart. And yet, here lies the great question. What if this confrontation is the key to freedom? What if the very parts of yourself you're most ashamed of hold the raw energy of your creativity, your authenticity, your power? What if the stranger at the edge of your bed is not an intruder, but a guide? Most people will never take that step. They will continue to blame circumstances, partners, rents, society, anything but the silent actor within. They will project their darkness onto enemies, onto politics, onto fate. They will live half-lives driven by forces they claim not to believe in, but you, reading this, are standing at a threshold. You can keep turning away, or you can turn inward. You can go on pretending your shadow isn't there, or you can face it and see what waits beyond the mask. In the next section, we'll journey deeper into why the shadow exists at all, how it is born in the psyche, how it hides in plain sight, and how thinkers from Jung to Nietzsche understood its power. Only by tracing its origins can we begin to see how it shapes not just our private lives, but our entire civilization. Step back for a moment and ask yourself, when did you first learn that parts of you were unacceptable? Was it when a parent's eyes darkened after you showed anger? When a teacher told you not to be so dramatic? When you laughed too loudly and someone whispered that you were too much? These are not small moments. They are the quiet chisels that carve the self you present to the world. From your earliest memories, you've been engaged in a silent negotiation with reality. On one side, your instincts, desires, fears, and raw emotions. On the other, the expectations of parents, culture, religion, school, peers. To belong, you must shape yourself. To survive, you must repress. This is the hidden economy of the psyche, and it's far more powerful than we admit. Carl Jung argued that this process is not an anomaly, but a universal law of psychological development. The persona, the mask we wear in society, is necessary. Without it, you couldn't function. Yet every mask has a cost. Behind each smile of politeness may lurk a grimace of suppressed rage. Behind every carefully curated identity may writhe the chaos of unacknowledged drives. Jung called this repressed totality the shadow, and he believed that ignoring it is like trying to build a house without acknowledging its foundation. But Jung wasn't alone in this insight. Friedrich Nietzsche warned of the dangers of moralized human beings who deny their instincts. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he described the last man, a creature of comfort, safety, and mediocrity who no longer strives or risks because he has anesthetized his passions. Arthur Schopenhauer, long before Jung, wrote of the blind will driving human behavior, a ceaseless force that reason can only veil, not eradicate. And in the 20th century, Aldous Huxley cautioned that societies built on repression breed neurosis, addiction, and authoritarian control. Put together, these thinkers were circling the same uncomfortable truth. The more you repress, the less you actually choose. The shadow is not some exotic anomaly. It is the inevitable byproduct of socialization. Every culture, no matter how progressive or traditional, demands a persona, and every persona casts a shadow. This is why you may find yourself doing things you don't believe in, sabotaging your own goals, or attracting relationships that echo old wounds. The shadow doesn't simply sit in the basement of your mind like a harmless collection of dusty boxes. It leaks upward. It shapes your emotions, your decisions, your political opinions, your secret fantasies. It hides in your self-image as a good person, as a hard worker, as a victim, as a rebel. It even hides in your spiritual practices, which can become elaborate rituals of avoidance rather than transformation. Modern psychology gives this ancient insight a new language. Neuroscience shows that unconscious processes govern the vast majority of our thoughts and behaviors. Cognitive biases, the shortcuts your brain uses to make decisions, are often just the shadow in disguise, distorting perception so you can maintain your preferred self-story. Trauma research reveals how unprocessed pain gets stored not only in memory but in the nervous system, shaping reactions long after the conscious mind moves on. This hidden force doesn't only affect individuals, it scales up. Entire societies project their shadows. Carl Jung watched Europe slide into the horrors of fascism and saw not only political failure but psychological projection, a collective refusal to own disowned impulses, aggression, envy, hunger for power that were instead cast onto scapegoats. Today, similar dynamics appear in polarized politics, in digital outrage cycles, in the urge to publicly shame rather than privately reflect. You can feel it in your own life. Think of the friend who rails against selfish people yet manipulates others for attention. Think of the activist who fights for justice but cannot bear dissent, exiling any nuance from their worldview. Think of the family member who preaches forgiveness but secretly nurses grudges. These are not hypocrites in the simple sense, they are humans split by their own shadows. And you are not exempt, none of us are. The hidden problem, then, is not just that you have a shadow, it's that you're encouraged to ignore it. Modern culture prizes image over substance. Social media amplifies the persona while shaming the messy, ambiguous parts of life. Self-help often sells sanitized positivity rather than real integration. Even therapy can become a performance if it is used only to polish the mask rather than encounter what lies beneath. This avoidance comes at a cost. Unacknowledged anger becomes depression. Suppressed desire becomes addiction. Disowned vulnerability becomes cruelty. In Jung's words, what you resist not only persists, but grows in size. By refusing to integrate the shadow, You hand it the keys to your life. It will drive, and you will call its route fate. And yet, paradoxically, the shadow is not merely destructive. Jung insisted that in its darkness lies gold. Your creativity, courage, erotic vitality, and sense of aliveness often hide in the very impulses you've buried. Integration does not mean indulging every impulse. It means facing them honestly, understanding their roots, and reclaiming their energy in conscious form. Why then do so few people do this work? Because it's terrifying. It's easier to project than to reflect. It's easier to hate an enemy than to see your own reflection in their flaws. It's easier to be a good person, according to someone else's checklist, than to wrestle with your own contradictions. Society rewards the mask, not the integration. And so we live divided lives, our shadows growing thicker with each unexamined year. But every divided life has a breaking point, a moment when the old persona no longer holds. Perhaps you're at that point now. Perhaps you feel the friction of pretending. Perhaps you sense that something deeper is calling you, even if you can't yet name it. This is where the story turns. To understand the shadow's grip, we must look at its consequences, not only in theory, but in the lived reality of your relationships, your choices, your society. What does it cost you to stay asleep? What does it cost all of us? In the next section, we'll explore the unseen consequences of ignoring the shadow, how it shapes destinies, drives societies into conflict, and silently scripts lives. Only by seeing these consequences clearly can we grasp why confronting the shadow is not a luxury, but a necessity. Imagine your life as a house with many rooms. The ones you proudly show guests are spotless, decorated, full of light. But there are locked doors too, rooms you haven't entered in years. At first you tell yourself they're empty. Then you tell yourself they're irrelevant. But when you sleep at night, you hear noises behind them, a low hum, a shuffle, sometimes a scream. What you don't realize is that these rooms are connected to the plumbing, the wiring, the foundation of your home. Ignore them long enough, and the whole house begins to rot from within. This is what happens when you refuse the shadow. The first consequence is subtle, a dullness in the soul, a sense that life is happening through a filter. You go through motions, work, relationships, hobbies, but everything feels muted, as if you're living someone else's story. This is not depression in the clinical sense. It's alienation, a quiet estrangement from yourself. You may smile and perform, but you no longer feel the pulse of your own aliveness. Carl Jung called this the problem of psychic inflation and psychic depletion. When the conscious ego inflates into a mask, the unconscious compensates by draining vitality. You may notice it as chronic fatigue, boredom, or a constant search for distraction. Addictions flourish here. Not only substances, but the subtler addictions: scrolling, shopping, workaholism, compulsive caretaking. Each is an attempt to fill the void left by disowned parts of the self. Another consequence is projection. Because you can't tolerate certain impulses in yourself, you begin to see them everywhere else. Your boss is arrogant, your friend selfish, your neighbor lazy, your partner too needy. Of course, some of these observations may be accurate, but the intensity, the heat behind them, is your clue. As Jung wrote, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. When the shadow is ignored, your perception becomes a hall of mirrors. You think you're fighting external enemies, but you're really wrestling your own reflection. This dynamic scales up to whole societies. Nations demonize other nations. Political tribes caricature each other. Religious groups scapegoat outsiders. Each is convinced of its moral superiority while unconsciously enacting the very traits it condemns. History is full of these projections. The more a culture prizes purity, the more violently it hunts impurity. The more it extols freedom, the more covertly it imposes control. We can see it in the witch trials, in colonialism, in modern cancel cultures, and moral panics. The shadow doesn't disappear, it changes costume. And then there's the toll on relationships. When you suppress anger, it leaks out as passive aggression. When you repress vulnerability, you become distant or controlling. When you deny your own needs, you resent others for theirs. The shadow sabotages intimacy because intimacy requires authenticity. You can't truly connect with another while hiding from yourself. Lovers, friends, even children feel this dissonance even if they can't name it. They sense the gap between what you show and what you feel. Over time, this gap breeds mistrust, confusion, or silent withdrawal. Unacknowledged shadows can also manifest somatically. Modern trauma research, Bessel van der Kolk, Gabor Mate, shows how repressed emotions lodge in the body as tension, chronic pain, immune issues. Carl Jung hinted at this when he spoke of the somatic unconscious. What we refuse to express psychically often returns as a physical symptom. Your panic attacks may be your shadow's alarm bell. Your insomnia may be the voice you refuse to hear in daylight. Perhaps the most insidious consequence is moral blindness. When you believe you're purely good, you become capable of harm without recognizing it. You may impose your will on others for their own good. You may weaponize your victimhood. You may preach love while practicing contempt. Jung warned that the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. The more virtuous your self-image, the more dangerous your disowned impulses. Many atrocities in history were committed not by obvious villains, but by people convinced of their righteousness. This isn't to shame you, it's to show how inevitable the shadow's influence is when unexamined. You may already be feeling echoes of this in your own life, a habit you can't break, a pattern in relationships, an inner critic you can't silence, a self you can't fully meet. You may suspect that something deeper drives you but feel afraid to look. That fear is normal. The shadow's whole strategy is avoidance. It thrives on your reluctance. Yet paradoxically, the shadow also signals where your greatest growth lies. Every projection is a breadcrumb. Every unwanted emotion is a doorway. What you envy in others may hint at your own unrealized potential. What you condemn may reveal your own buried hunger. Integration begins the moment you stop running from these signs. The question becomes, what happens when enough individuals refuse to confront their shadows? The answer is written in our headlines: polarization, loneliness, ecological destruction, leaders who mirror our worst instincts because they are our worst instincts. When collective shadows go unintegrated, societies act out their unconscious drives on a massive scale. Wars become rituals of projection. Economic systems reward exploitation. Even technology becomes an extension of our disowned impulses for control, speed, domination. Carl Jung believed that the survival of civilization might depend on individuals doing this inner work. "The world will ask you who you are," he wrote, "and if you do not know, the world will tell you." In other words, if you don't own your shadow, it will be owned for you by demagogues, by propaganda, by addiction industries, by algorithms designed to exploit your unconscious drives. This is the cost of staying asleep. A life that feels smaller than it should, relationships that never quite touch the soul, a society that mistakes repression for morality and projection for truth. The shadow doesn't punish you out of malice. It simply acts in proportion to your refusal. But there is another path. There always is. In every myth, the hero descends into the underworld not as punishment, but as initiation. And confronting the shadow is your underworld. And like every underworld, it contains treasure. In the next section, we'll explore the rebellion, how to break free, not a neat checklist or a sanitized 5 steps, but the deep, counterintuitive moves that allow you to integrate the shadow rather than be ruled by it. Because the real work isn't about perfection, it's about wholeness. Picture a prisoner who has lived in chains so long that freedom terrifies him. The bars may wound his wrists, the cell may suffocate his spirit, but at least he knows its boundaries. Outside, there is risk, uncertainty, the unknown. To confront your shadow is to walk out of this cell, and the first sensation will not be relief, it will be fear. Jung once said that the meeting with oneself is the most unpleasant thing. Why? Because we don't meet only our virtues, we meet our cruelty, our envy, our lust, our rage. Yet here lies the rebellion, refusing to be ruled by fear of your own depths. Breaking free begins not with running away from the darkness, but with turning toward it. But how? Not by indulging the shadow blindly, nor by trying to annihilate it. The rebellion is subtler. It begins with radical honesty, the courage to admit what you feel, even if it contradicts the person you believe yourself to be. Notice your anger before it becomes bitterness. Acknowledge your envy before it festers into sabotage. Confess your loneliness instead of burying it under distraction. The shadow shrinks when it is spoken. This doesn't mean you must act on every impulse. To confront the shadow is not to become reckless, but to integrate. Think of it as alchemy, raw materials transformed by awareness. Anger becomes assertiveness. Envy becomes inspiration. Fear becomes humility. Lust becomes vitality. The shadow is not destroyed, it is transmuted. Throughout history, we find examples of people who chose this path. The mystics of nearly every tradition spoke of dark nights of the soul, periods when all light vanished, forcing them to face the depths within. Nietzsche described the necessity of becoming who you are, a process that requires confronting instincts society deems unacceptable. Even Dostoevsky's characters, tormented by contradictions, embody this struggle. They collapse when they deny it, but they transform when they face it. The rebellion often begins small. It may look like journaling with brutal honesty, writing down not just your noble thoughts, but your petty ones. It may mean sitting with emotions instead of anesthetizing them. It may mean admitting to a trusted friend or therapist the things you swore you'd never say aloud. It may mean recognizing that the person who irritates you most is teaching you something about yourself. This work is dangerous in the best sense. It destabilizes the comfortable lie. It dismantles the persona you've worn for years. People around you may resist, because your shadow work threatens their illusions too. If you stop playing the pleaser, others may accuse you of being selfish. If you stop being the strong one, others may resent your vulnerability. But this is part of liberation. Breaking free means accepting that not everyone will applaud your wholeness. There is also rebellion in rethinking morality itself. Schopenhauer and Nietzsche both warned that morality, when rigid, often serves as repression disguised as virtue. Jung agreed. Shadow integration requires moving beyond black and white notions of good and bad to embrace complexity. This doesn't mean abandoning ethics. It means recognizing that true morality arises when you face your own capacity for harm, not when you deny it. The integrated person is less likely to project evil onto others precisely because they know it dwells in themselves. Another layer of rebellion lies in confronting collective shadows. Ask yourself, what does your culture repress? What impulses, voices, or truths are silenced? Perhaps its vulnerability in a culture obsessed with strength. Perhaps its slowness in a culture addicted to speed. Perhaps its mortality in a culture obsessed with youth. By embodying what your society denies, you become a living act of resistance. Consider how Aldous Huxley warned of a future where pleasure itself becomes a tool of control. Our modern addictions to screens, entertainment, and shallow validation are shadows of a society afraid of silence and depth. To resist is not simply to delete an app, it is to confront why you cling to distraction in the first place. The rebellion is inward as much as outward. You may wonder, what if I go too far? What if I drown in the shadow instead of integrating it? This fear is real. Jung cautioned that shadow work must be balanced by grounding in the conscious self. That's why practices of stability, rituals, relationships, creative work are essential. They anchor you while you explore the depths. Think of it as holding a rope while descending into a cave. Without the rope, you risk being lost. With it, you can descend and return stronger. The real risk is not going too far, but not going far enough. Most people dabble in shadow work, acknowledge a flaw here, a regret there, then retreat into comfort. But real transformation requires persistence. Integration is not a weekend project, it is a lifelong discipline. Each stage of life reveals new shadows, the unclaimed ambition of youth, the suppressed grief of midlife, the fear of mortality in old age. Each must be faced anew. The reward? Freedom. Not the shallow freedom of doing whatever you want, but the deeper freedom of not being unconsciously driven. Freedom from compulsions that once ruled you, freedom from self-deception, freedom to choose, not because the shadow disappears, but because you've befriended it. Imagine standing in front of a mirror, seeing not only the face you choose of the world, but also the one you've hidden. And instead of recoiling, you nod. You recognize both as yourself. This is integration. This is wholeness. The rebellion, then, is not against society, parents, or fate. It is against the tyranny of your own avoidance. To break free is to say, I will not be ruled by the parts of me I refuse to see. And yet, even this is not the final truth. For beyond rebellion lies something greater, not just confrontation, but transcendence. To face the shadow is to glimpse the deepest paradox of human existence, that the very darkness we fear may contain the light we seek. In the final section, we will explore the ultimate truth, the final, most powerful realization, a revelation that reframes the shadow not as an enemy, but as a teacher, and shows how integration is not the end of the journey, but the beginning of true freedom. Imagine walking deeper into a forest at night. The path you've taken for years ends abruptly, swallowed by darkness. For a moment you hesitate. The old you, the persona, wants to turn back. But another part of you, older than fear, steps forward. At first you can see nothing, only hear the sound of your own breath. Then slowly, your eyes adjust. Shapes emerge. The darkness isn't empty at all. It's alive. This is what happens at the far edge of shadow work. You no longer see your darkness as an intruder or a flaw to be eradicated. You begin to recognize it as an aspect of wholeness, an organ of the psyche, as essential as your heart or lungs. The final realization is not that you have a shadow, it's that you are bigger than your shadow and your persona combined. Carl Jung called this greater totality the self, not the ego self, but the deeper center of being that holds all opposites. The ego lives in dualities, good, bad, light, dark, success, failure. But the self holds the tension until a third thing emerges, a synthesis. Integration of the shadow is only a doorway into this larger self. When you step through, you realize you're not a collection of fragments. You're the field in which all fragments arise. This realization is not abstract. You feel it in your body. The same anger that once frightened you now vibrates as clean energy in your chest. The envy that once shamed you now appears as a signal of your own neglected desires. The grief you avoided now softens you into compassion. You begin to sense that nothing inside you is wasted. Everything, even the ugliest impulse, can be composted into wisdom. The paradox deepens. The more you integrate the shadow, the less you need to defend your image. You no longer have to pretend to be perfect. You no longer have to project your flaws onto others. You can own your mistakes, your contradictions, your vulnerability. And because you're no longer at war with yourself, you're freer to engage the world without hidden agendas. Your relationships shift, your creativity expands, your presence deepens. You also see society differently. You no longer fall so easily for scapegoats and simple villains. You recognize how collective shadows shape politics, media, even spirituality. This doesn't make you cynical. It makes you clear-eyed. You see that real change begins not with purging the bad out there, but with integrating the disowned forces in here. As Jung put it, the world hangs on a thin thread, and that is the psyche of man. This is the point where rebellion becomes stewardship. At first, shadow work feels like a private war, but the ultimate truth reveals it as a kind of service. Every time you integrate a piece of your own darkness, you reduce the darkness available to be projected onto others. You stop adding to the collective storm. In this sense, doing inner work is not self-indulgence. It is quiet activism. Yet the deepest revelation is even more radical. When you've gone far enough, you start to glimpse that the shadow itself was never your enemy. It was your teacher, your unfinished elf. It pushed you toward wholeness by refusing to be ignored. Like a mythic guide in disguise, it dragged you into the underworld so you could retrieve the parts of you you'd lost. This is why so many myths end, not with the monster's destruction, but with its transformation. The dragon becomes a guardian of treasure. The beast becomes an ally. In psychological terms, the shadow becomes a source of authentic power. Not power over others, but the power to live without pretense, to speak truth without aggression, to love without illusion. From this vantage point, the stranger at the edge of your bed from our opening scene no longer looks like a threat. You recognize them. They are you, the you who waited patiently for acknowledgement. You invite them to sit closer. In their eyes, you see not only darkness but depth, not only pain but vitality. They reach out their hand, you take it, and for the first time, you feel whole. Of course, the work doesn't end here. The shadow is never done. It evolves as you do. Each new stage of life reveals new layers, but once you've tasted integration, you no longer fear the descent. You know the way. You know that the darkness is navigable. You know that inside it waits not annihilation, but expansion. The ultimate truth is simple yet profound. Wholeness is more powerful than perfection. The world doesn't need more perfect masks. It needs more integrated human beings. It needs people who can hold complexity without splitting into enemies and saints. It needs people who can act with strength without denying their vulnerability, and with compassion without denying their anger. And it begins with you. Not tomorrow, not when you're ready, but now, in the small moments when the shadow whispers. When you catch yourself blaming someone, pause and ask, what part of me am I seeing? When you feel an impulse you dislike, don't immediately suppress it. Get curious. Write it down. Breathe. Speak it aloud to someone you trust. These tiny acts of honesty are revolutionary. Remember Jung's warning. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. But remember also his promise. In the shadow lies gold. By turning toward what you fear in yourself, you reclaim what you've been searching for all along, your own vitality, authenticity, and freedom. So here you stand, at the edge of your own forest. The path is unlit. The air is thick. Somewhere ahead, the stranger waits. Take a breath. Step forward. The darkness will not destroy you. It will introduce you to yourself.